in the Old Testament and Liturgical Press's New Feminist Commentary on the Psalms. She also has additional articles and chapters pending in Westminster John Knox publication on God and Guns and Liturgical Press's Wisdom of Solomon Commentary. Norton's ordained clergy in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and she has been featured in Essence Ebony, the New York Times, and a host of other print and media platforms for her creative worship design and innovative preaching in the creation and curation of the Beyonce Mass, which she is going to talk to us about this morning. She's hosted this Mass in venues around the world, including New York, Lisbon, and Los Angeles. The title of her talk this morning is Harnessing Black Girl Magic, the Beyonce Mass and Womanist Worship. Wanda.
There we go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Small technical difficulty, but absolutely worked out. So I'll start. I'm going to jump right in. I want to start by telling you a little bit of how we got to Beyonce Mass. And so I'll narrate for you some of the history, a little bit of the concept behind some of the liturgies that we've done, and then show you some of what this has looked like in various places. So the Beyonce Mass was born out of a class that I teach on Beyonce in the Hebrew Bible. So as a womanist biblical scholar who's very interested in intersectionality and interdisciplinarity, with particular foci on ethics and homiletics, I'm always thinking of how I can get my students to think about biblical interpretation in a practical sense. So I remember that being a seminarian, one of the biggest critiques that my colleagues had of biblical studies courses was, I can't use anything that you're telling me in the classroom in my congregation. So I try to create something of a laboratory at some point in the semester that forces students to start to think about this new content and how it will live in practical spaces. So because my minor areas were in ethics and homiletics in my doctoral program, these were issues that I had to think of very early on. And in constructing courses for minor areas, I constructed a kind of traditional womanist biblical interpretation class. And in that class, every unit has a novel that students read. Stacey Floyd Thomas, who's one of my ethics professors, often says that it's easier to deal with issues of racism, sexism, patriarchy, heteroaggression, and the like, if you do it outside of the context of the news or documentaries. That the easiest way to get people to evaluate how systems live in the world is through novels. And so in doing ethical inquiry, we read a lot of novels. So in womanist biblical interpretation, we do similar kinds of work. But I also wanted to develop an iteration of the class that I felt like lived in more modern popular culture. And because Beyonce is just a little bit older than me, because I grew up listening to Destiny's Child and then to her solo repertoire, because very early on in my ministry, there were young Black women who felt like they couldn't relate to me because they had not seen Black women in clergy roles, and music, particularly the music of Beyonce, became a kind of identifier that was able to connect them. My mind immediately went to creating a course that used the music, life, persona of Beyonce to have this kind of conversation about womanist thought. The idea in a womanist biblical interpretation class like Beyonce in the Hebrew Bible is that because most of my students are not Black women, there has to be a way to narrate the kinds of interests and needs that Black women are facing that develop the hermeneutic, the way that we engage the biblical text. So in developing the class, we need to constantly be having this conversation about how Black women view things, the multiplicity of ways that Black people encounter particular issues in society. So the first assignment in Beyonce and the Hebrew Bible was that we were going to develop a worship service that told the story of Black women, talks about our struggles, our theologies, our narratives, our spirituality. Do that within an explicitly kind of Christian context of chapel, but without using any hymns. And so instead to use the music of Beyonce to do that work. So over a 2-week period, I walked with my students through the development of this chapel service. I currently at SFTS have started a Womanist Symposium. It's about a 3-day event that brings in scholars and practitioners from around the country to talk about womanist issues. This was the inaugural year of the Womanist Symposium. And so we had Trisha Fra Brown, who is an ethicist by training, but homiletician by practice. And so teaches, is the homiletics professor at Emory, womanist scholar par excellence. So she was doing both a lecture and a sermon. She lectured Thursday night and preached Friday night in a traditional Black church chapel service. And I wanted to have this experimental worship live in that symposium. So that Thursday, in our kind of laboratory chapel service, we did what I call the initial Beyonce Mass. So we did the Mass, or the chapel service, at the seminary, Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, which is an Episcopal church. Found out about this chapel service because a student who was in my class was interning at Grace Cathedral in their midweek worship service. And so they asked that we would come and do this Mass in their alternative worship service. 50 to 100 people. That was the chorus that kept ringing in everybody's ears. This midweek service tends to have about 50 to 100 people. So we weren't going to do it in the main sanctuary. They have a little small chapel. We were thinking about like a retractable projector, right? Little bitty screen. And anecdotally, I'll say that I left to go officiate a friend's wedding, and we were still talking about 50 to 100 people. When I came back and was teaching actually the Beyonce and the Hebrew Bible class, I opened my laptop and I had 11 emails from reporters across the country wanting to talk about this thing, the Beyonce Mass that was happening at Grace Cathedral. In the span of 72 hours, we went from anticipating 50 to 100 people to trying to make sense of whether we would have somewhere between 1,000 to 3,000 people show up at this worship service. We had a little over 1,000 people come to this worship service, which was in and of itself a news phenomenon, because 1,000 people at worship in San Francisco where nobody goes to church is a particular kind of phenomenon. So with the amount of attention that the Mass got from San Francisco, it has opened up avenues. We've had invitations and hosted the Mass. As Jen said, we've been in Lisbon, New York City, DC, Atlanta, Southern California. And so I really had an opportunity to have this global conversation about womanist theology and worship. So what does a Beyonce Mass look like? It is, as I say, often a very traditional Christian worship service, except for that we don't have hymns. And we are espousing a womanist theology of liberation and inclusion. So the worship almost exclusively starts with a pretty high tempo song, and the call to worship is embedded in that song. We generally move from that into welcome, some kind of invocation and prayer. And from there, we tend to have a kind of testimony in a homiletic sense. When we talk about preaching, we often talk about narrating trouble in the world and then trouble in the text. And so this narration at this particular moment nods towards the trouble in the world. What are the issues that need to be named that we're facing theologically, socially, and politically in the world? And that is, again, embedded in a song. And we move from that into, sometimes that problem is presented in the sermonic selection. Sometimes there's an additional song that narrates the sermonic selection and or narrates the testimony, and then we do the sermonic selection. Following that kind of set of songs, I preach. After I preach, there's a response to the word that is both usually scriptural, but also has a kind of song component to it. And then from there, we have a passing of the peace. After the passing of the peace, we generally do communion. And then after communion, we have thank yous and a sending off song that includes the benediction in that final song. So that's a kind of general overview. I wanted to say a little bit something more specific about what we did in Washington, D.C., because we had a peculiar complex in this space. Because we were at the Kennedy Center, it was one of the first times that we had done the Mass in a non-church space, because I'm traditionally very adamant about being in church space that pushes people to think about these intersections between the quote unquote paradigm of sacred and secular. And the DC Mass and the Claremont Mass, both of which happened this year, were both in spaces that were not the church. And that was me wrestling with myself and wanting to offer an alternative vision of making something that is not a traditional church building sacred space. So as the Mass evolves, and I'm wrestling with my own theologies and intentions and trying to name those things explicitly in the spaces where we are present. So that being said, we ended up at the Kennedy Center, which was its own kind of peculiar reality, because the Kennedy Center is not only a clearly secular space, but it's a government space. And I was concerned about the ways in which they would push back at the explicitly Christian content of the Mass. It turned out that the Kennedy Center actually didn't have a problem letting the Mass sit in a particularly Christian context, partly because it was the day that we did the Mass was International Women's Day, and the Mass was a transitional moment from the end of Black Girls Rock to the beginning of this Cross Currents festival that they were doing. So the Christianity part was not a problem. What did become a problem was the coronavirus. So this is 9 days ago. And as we're rehearsing, the Kennedy Center says to us, we can't do communion, which we always do communion in the Beyonce Mass, but they said we cannot do communion because they were just not sure how things were going to unfold with the coronavirus, and they were afraid of all of the touching of elements. So we had to reconfigure what that looked like. I'm always completely on board with doing the thing that is the safest in a public health context. It was in some ways a disorienting moment, because the presence of communion in my mind is the most kind of theocentric community participation moment that we have in worship broadly, but specifically in the Beyonce Mass. And so that created its own unique struggles. That being said, we're at the Kennedy Center. It's International Women's Day, Black Girls Rock, Cross Currents. What are we going to do a Mass about? I want the Mass to be about the persistent struggle of Black women and how we have overcome and lived in spaces that have not always been hospitable, welcoming, affirming for us. So we start this Mass with Survivor, Destiny's Child song, and there's a kind of call to worship that says, right, that where two or three are gathered, doesn't matter what that structure looks like, where two or three are gathered, Jesus is in our midst. And so no matter what people say about this worship, we are gathered here for a holy endeavor. And we want to acknowledge all the things that it took for people to be present in this space, all the things that folks had to survive to come to worship. From there, I did the welcome and an invocation prayer, and then we went into heaven. And heaven was our, as I alluded to last night, was really a prayer of repentance and a testimony service at the same time. So Black Girl Magic, which is our lead vocal ensemble that I'll talk about a little bit in a moment, they sang Heaven all the way through. And for those people who don't know, Heaven is a song that Beyonce wrote after she had had a series of miscarriages to name her grief and her lament to the children that she had lost. And so the ensemble sang the song all the way through, and then at the end of the song we named 20 Black trans women who have been killed in the past year and a half, which is a drop in the bucket. The 20 is a drop in a bucket of the number of women of color, trans women of color who've been killed, but I wanted to name some. So we named them, we had their pictures up on the screen. And once we were done naming them, I had one of my former students read a prayer that I had written that really repented for the ways in which this world had not been able to hold them as sacred, had not been able to honor their bodies and their spirits. And so we moved from that prayer of honoring them and praying that they had peace with God, to an articulation that, like, for those of us who are still here in the world, we have work to do. And so the next song was I Was Here. And embedded in that was 2 sets of clips. I worked with a videographer and a student at Howard University, and they interviewed a series of folks, mostly Black women, and asked them, like, what do you want your legacy to be? What are you willing to fight for? What are the things that really matter? So embedded in the song I Was Here was these voices of folks saying, like, love is the thing that really matters. Community is the thing that I'm really willing to fight for. I want justice. I want to leave this kind of positive legacy. So after that, my sermon was from Esther. Perhaps you were created for such a time as this. And I really wanted to engage a womanist hermeneutic on that and naming, right, all the ways that some of us who have been marginalized might be tired and frustrated and want to operate in what little privilege we have. And yet we are all compelled by God's economy to fight for the justice of our community. And that our community needs to look broader than the things that are convenient and easy for us. After that sermon, again, we couldn't do communion. So the response to the word for me needed to be a prayer that intimated something communal and theocentric. So we moved into a prayer. We had rocks that we all wrote on, the team. We wrote words on: racism, sexism, ableism, and every person who walked in the door was given a rock. And so we, myself and Gabe Byron, who's a New Testament scholar at Howard Divinity School, kind of named in the space that God is not calling us to be perfect, but prophetic. And that we wanted to lay down our sinfulness, and that laying down sinfulness is not kind of the way that we have traditionally named sin, but to lay down the burden of our sinfulness means to lay down these communal sins of racism and sexism and the like. And so we challenged people. We had ushers coming around and taking the rocks, placing them in buckets. And we asked people as they put the rock in the bucket to lay down the weight of these isms and walk away with God's grace. And then we moved into a kind of prayer that was Flaws and All, which is our normal communion song. And I'll play a clip from that in a moment. But after that, the thing we wanted to name was that when you lay those things down, then you have an ability to put love on top. And so the choir sang Love on Top, and we did a kind of passing of the piece we wanted to name Coronavirus is Real, be very careful, do what makes you feel the most comfortable, but at least look somebody in the eye and let them know that God loves them and that you do too. And we move from Love on Top to what are we going to leave here with? Well, let's start over. And in that song, Beyonce says, let's start over, let's give love their wings. And so that's how we sent people into the world, is with a challenge to start over and build new community and try new relationships. And one of the things that I'm always most encouraged about is when people have this aha moment at the end of the Mass. So there was a Catholic reporter who I wasn't aware was at the Mass, but when he wrote on the Mass, he said, I walked out and I heard these two elderly Black women saying to one another, yeah, let's start over. And it was then that it clicked for him that Beyonce had not been mentioned anywhere in the worship service, that her music sat as a part of a telling of the story, but that we don't talk about Beyonce. There's no deification of Beyonce. She doesn't work her way into the sermons. We're not quoting her. There are times when I've given kind of nods in the sermon where something feels appropriate in the same way that I might give a nod to a Michael Jackson lyric or whatever else. But we're not focusing on the persona of Beyonce, because it's not really what the Mass is about. It's really about telling Black women's stories and offering a liberative theology. So I'm gonna try very hard to be apt enough to share the screen here. I think that has worked, and bring up this clip for you all to see. Let's see if this works. That's this.
We are called to the prophetic task of destroying all things that do not honor the dignity of life here on earth.
For the work of God requires that we make communal provision for the body. This is the great exchange, to lay down the burdens of the body, burdens of hatred and division, the weight of exclusion and apathy, the sickness of poverty and punishment.
It does not require that we be perfect, but prayerful. It does not require that we be flawless, but faithful.
So here, we ask that you enter into a posture of prayer. We have ushers in the aisle. We ask that you would follow their directions. When you came in, you were given a rock. Lay the rock in the buckets. Lay down the weight of our human failure and walk away with the grace of God. And as you prepare, hear this prayer. I'm a train wreck in the morning. I'm a bitch in the afternoon. Every now and then without warning. It can be really mean towards you. I'm a puzzle, yes indeed. Every complex in every way. And all the pieces aren't even in the bar. And yet, you see the picture clear as day. Don't know why you love me. That's this.
So that gives you a sense, the things that of the kind of energy that happens around the Mass, the things that I want to highlight that you saw that I have not mentioned. If you could tell, there were these banners that were hanging from the side. I'm constantly affronted and slightly offended by the overtly white and Eurocentric imagery that exists in the church, right? The stained glass is almost always kind of this blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus, and even in Black churches, in Black spaces. And so as a response to that, I had someone design these banners that are 19 feet tall, and there are 6 of them that hang in whatever space we are in. And in that space, and so there's 3 sets of them, so 3 different kinds, 2 of each. One gives imagery of Black women sass, one is Black women praying, and one is Black women dancing, right? So in thinking about how to depict something holy about the womanist definition, those are the kind of 3 primary images that I wanted us to hold on to: prayer, dance, because Alice Walker talks about Black women loving dance, loving music. Because womanist sass, Black women sass is so much a part of our identity, and I think a part of what Alice Walker is talking about when she talks about this folk expression of being womanish and wanting to focus on Black female spirituality. So we have these banners that hang. Oftentimes when we're in an ecclesial space, I'll have the banners either covering the white stained glass or sitting next to as a counter image. So that's one piece. You will also have noted that the ensemble and myself were wearing these purple shirts, purple being the womanist color, that say, "Won't she do it?" For those folks who are kind of rooted in the Black church tradition, they'll know that there's a call and response in ebb and flow in Black preaching, and there's a common kind of vernacular exchange where the preacher will go, "Won't he do it?" referring to God, and the congregation will respond back, "Won't he will?" And so there's a young Black woman who's was initially based out of Indianapolis, but now based out of Honolulu, who's a pastor. Her and her business partner developed a line of shirts that say, "Won't she do it?" To encompass something about God and the feminine. And so people who are a part of the Beyonce Mass team wear this purple shirt that says, "Won't she do it?" to signify that kind of subversiveness. So the development of the Mass is about not just writing a different kind of inclusive liturgy, but allowing all aspects of the space to be subversive in developing a liberative theology. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over for questions, is those wonderful singers that you heard up front are our Black Girl Magic Ensemble. When we go into a city, we recruit a volunteer ensemble of people of all races, ages, genders, gender identities, sexualities. And we have, it used to be that the text sheet asks that we find a Black female, a single Black female lead singer. However, when I came to Lisbon to do the Mass in March of 2019, they had apparently tried to find a particular Black female singer to lead who cost too much. And in the last moments before I arrived, they were scrambling to find a volunteer choir and a Black female lead. They did not tell me that because they were afraid that I wouldn't get on the plane. But at the last minute, they were able to identify 9 Black women to be the choir. So take turns doing lead vocals and serve as this kind of ensemble. It worked out quite perfectly because when I met them, I was struck by their voices and by their spirits. And so after hearing them for the first time, I dubbed them the Black Girl Magic Ensemble. And so it is now the case that these women, wherever we go to do the Mass, we fly the women in from Lisbon. So our lead vocalists come from Portugal, and then we recruit a Mass choir to back them up. And for me, that's important, one, because it's a group of Black women who also understand the mission of this project. It helps us continue to move beyond kind of the possibility of a kind of cult of personality around me to a communal group of people who are developing this work. And it's important because they're heavily talented, but they're also have this kind of great spirit and they understand the core of the work that we're trying to do. So I'll leave it there and turn it over for questions.
Now we've all been muted.
You should be unmuted now, Jennifer. I did an unmute all, and suddenly there was all this like feedback and stuff, but you should be unmuted now.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. All right, so can take questions just like we did last night with in the chat. And we've got one already from Lonnie. What has been the response of mainline Black churches to the Beyonce Mass? Oh yeah.
Better unmute.
There we go.
There we go.
So can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the response has been mixed. I have actually been more surprised at how supportive the Black church has been than not. I have absolutely gotten all the negative responses that you might have expected. So I've gotten the hate mail, I've gotten the death threats, I've gotten all of those kinds of pushback, but I have been also overwhelmed by the people who have had these kind of really meaningful, thoughtful responses. And it has meant I have not had to publicly respond. I've been unwilling to publicly respond to the attacks, but I'm always encouraged because by the time I see something, people have already responded. I kind of say anecdotally that like one of the first responses I got was actually from a former student of mine at Vanderbilt, and he wrote a very long, very passionate post against the Beyonce mass, and we don't need anything but Jesus. This is blasphemy, and many of my other former students were like, "That's ridiculous. You know her. You know her work. You know better than this." And his response was, "Oh, guys, I didn't actually read the article. I just saw the headline. I didn't realize." And more often than not, most of the really negative response that I have gotten has been from people who have in some way, shape, or form indicated that they haven't actually engaged the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Letitia asked, how do you respond when people say secular music is inappropriate for a worship setting? Also, how has Beyonce responded to the Beyonce mass?
I'm going to answer that second question first. She hasn't, which is actually great for me, in part because I don't want the mass to become like Kanye Sunday service. So again, like that, we're not really focused on the personality of Beyonce as much as the kind of music, and that's not to erase her identity. It's just not the focus. And again, I think that we have so number one, we have to name that this sacred secular paradigm is not something that was really operating as drastically in the biblical world as it operates in our own kind of consciousness. So that's number one. Number two, I think Black people in particular, but the church has a long history of intersecting the quote unquote secular with the sacred. And so I think that oftentimes the problem that people have is the actual person that I'm using, or the idea of using a Black woman over and against the idea of it being secular music. And it's partly why I have to name, this is not a cult of personality. It's not about Beyonce. It's not about me. I am not using Beyonce to even develop a normative ethic. Like, people should be like Beyonce. I'm simply using that music. We are using that music to tell a story of what sits in the world. It's very much about a descriptive ethic, and when we get to the prescriptive ethic, it's offering an ethic of how God and how Jesus operate in the world in healing, inclusive, and liberative ways.
There's a question from David. There's often been Leticia says, thank you. There has often been a false choice in the church between excellence versus participation. Can you talk about how you are mindful of both of those in the Beyonce mass?
So I'm going to answer what I think is your question, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe I'll restate what I think is your question. So I maybe hear you saying this idea of all are welcome means that people get to do whatever they want in the church, and we're not really mindful of their aptitudes and skills and gifts to do that work before we give them particular tasks. Is that kind of what you're alluding to?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think for that reason, I don't let anybody on the core team, right? So I have about 4 or 5 people who are what we call the core team, who help with logistics and execution. Before you can be a part of the core team, you have to have taken the class. So there's nobody on that team that doesn't know the work, doesn't know the kind of deep womanist theological inquiry that we're doing. And that was partially born out of the reality that when we started doing this work with Grace Cathedral, I was so focused on my students that I didn't realize that was not a space that was prepared to center womanist thought and a womanist vision. And so it meant that I'm more particular about having people who've done the work on the team, number one. Number two, it means that we almost always have some kind of educational experience that's added around the Mass. So some kind of panel of womanist scholars or talk back Q&A that is a part of the work that we're doing. So that's number one. Two, if this is not an everybody come, I want to help kind of thing. Second thing is part of having Black Girl Magic ensemble as our lead vocalist is that it means that I know going into this that I have folks who are committed to the mission, but who can really sing. And I say to whoever is doing the work of recruiting the volunteer choir that backs them up, two things. Number one, we want a diversity of people. And two, we want people who can do something a little bit more than make a joyful noise. I appreciate a joyful noise, and it's not necessarily the space, right? And I think the other thing that we do is like that in some ways weeds people out who might otherwise want to jump on, is that we require a fair amount of practice, that we're not, this is not a performance, it is a worship service, but worship has performative components and we often ignore those realities, which is why we sometimes lose some excellence. And I just believe that God desires excellence from us. And so if you can't be there for the preparation, then we don't want, you can't participate in the Mass. And so we are pretty particular about people committing to do the work. You don't have to have it all figured out, but if you can't when we come into town, if you can't be committed to partner with us and working on this thing that you say you're committed to, then this is just not the space.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments, curiosities? I guess a question I have is what, you've talked about it kind of was almost a whirlwind, right? Where it took on this energy, it became like really kind of a movement, almost like, what do you, and I know you barely kind of have time to maybe sit and like really reflect and process things in a way. But have you given much thought to the trajectory of the Beyonce Mass, the future of it? I mean, obviously you have other scholarly projects, you have scholarly projects that are going on as well. And you've talked some about how these two things intersect, but have you and your team talked about like what the next things are? Like, obviously there's still a lot of energy around the Beyonce Mass as it is already. And I think that could be happening for a long time, but yeah, are there thoughts about next steps or next projects, that kind of thing?
So my bigger interest is in developing broader conversations about womanist theology. So one of the things I said last night is like, this work that I love, most people don't know about. So it was a sobering thing for me very early on in my time as a scholar to be in conversations with other Black women, successful, educated Black women in other fields, right? People who have PhDs, lawyers, doctors, and say womanist, and have them say, wait, pause, what are you talking about? What does that word mean? So part of where I see my energy going as a scholar is to ensuring that this work that womanist scholars are doing, myself included, has broader access points. And so I'm focused on this larger rubric of womanist public theology and seeing the Beyonce Mass as a project within that. So that's one piece. I feel like I probably don't have the energy or wherewithal to do this for much more than like 2 or 3 more years. And the 2 or 3 year commitment is an arc of helping, again, create a base for future projects, to making sure that the Black Girl Magic Ensemble, who that they are continuing to learn about womanist theology and continuing to grow their voices. So they hate it because as we have gone on, I've tried to speak less and give them more voice in public spaces. One of my favorite moments, we were at Spelman doing a talk back, and someone asked a question of the whole group, and I said, so I'm going to make a brief comment and then I'm going to leave space for these women to talk. And so I talked and I looked at them, and one of my kind of stronger members of the group said, in plain English, even though Portuguese is their first language, said in plain English, I don't speak English. Like that was the response, because they're really trying to find their voice. But for me, a part of this learning process is to help encourage the voices and the agency and ingenuity of Black women. So I think those are our kind of primary goals, is to kind of solidify the work. We have a target group of cities that we want to hit before we stop. And then we keep having other cities who engage. But I think probably in the next 3 years, we'll stop this and transition this to whatever's after that.
Yeah. So we got to work in Minneapolis before you're done.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lucy says, I appreciate the talk so much. This is a very logistical question, but as somebody who has encountered a lot of aspects of copyright issues in various projects, I'm wondering if there are any issues along copyright lines with using Beyonce's music in public spaces.
So for me, that's a logistical issue, but it is a theological issue because it's a justice issue. So I purchased the rights, the copyrights to her catalog for both live performance and live streaming. And there were lots of legal folks that I talked to who said, well, we're not sure if you have to do this because you have some kinds of protection under educational fair use and ecclesial fair use. But if we're using her music, then we want to honor the work that she's done. And so it felt like the just thing to do was to pay not only for the copyrights, but every time we use the sheet music, I pay to download and use the music, because there are enough Black women who have their work being appropriated and not honored appropriately. So that is my nod of respect to not only Beyonce, but to the work of the community.
Yeah. Great. So, and Lucy here says, that's exactly my mindset as well. And I feel it's such a deeply respectful way to approach this. And she sends her thanks. Great. Any questions? We're coming up on an hour here, so I want to be mindful of folks' time and all of that. Maybe I'll do a last call. Lonnie asked, would you consider adding dance?
No. So I think I honor and respect liturgical dance. I think that we've had that conversation several times about how that could sit in the worship service. And I think it's just not something that it's not a logistical component that we're committed to adding to the Mass. Where we did a Mass on embodiment in New York City, and that issue came up again, and I said no. What we did do was to have a videographer go around New York, and we asked people to dance. And so when we had the first song, what you saw in the background, and the first song was Bootylicious, what you saw in the background was people dancing.
Great. Thank you. Well, so Lonnie says she was thinking more of professional dance troupes, yeah.
Yeah, even in that regard, I think that there are spaces for that. For me, I was more interested in having everyday people dance because I think there's a joy that was demonstrated in watching that on the screen. But yeah, and it's not what this project is oriented towards, and so I think we have made a kind of communal decision to not to pursue that aspect of worship.
Great. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we can have a silent applause for Yolanda. Yes.
Thank you.
All the various ways. There we go. And thank you so much for joining us and for the conversation. And it's always great to hear